Examining the melodies of the exegesis, literally interpretations, made by Grigorios Protopsaltis to the Petros Peloponnesios Hymnologion, we found that most of their syllables have a duration of 2 beats. Nevertheless, there are some sporadic extra-melismatic passages, the syllables of which have a duration of more than 8 beats. In our presentation, we will deal with these long melismas. By analyzing manuscripts that include hymnologic pieces written in the old method or Kievan 5-line notation, we aim to detect the history of these melismas and their possible melodic evolution through time. Setting as a minimum threshold of melismaticity the duration of 9 beats, we found 22 cases of extensive melismas in Grigorios' exegesis of Petros Peloponnesios Hymnologion. Then, based on the similarity of the melismas between each other, we classified them into the following 5 sets. The S1 set contains the M1 and M2, which show only a few minor differences regarding their analysis. These 2 cases constitutes the complete version of this melisma, while the M3 is a headless version of it. In the S2 set, the M4 to M11 are identical to each other, and they give the complete version of this melisma. In contrary, the M12 is a headless version of it. The melismas of S3 show no significant differentiation. The S4 set can be further divided into 2 subsets. The sigma 1, where the M17 and M19 belong, and the sigma 2, where the M18 and M20 belong. The melismas of the first subset show shorter beginning phrases than those of the second one. The S5 set contains the M21 and M22, which show only a few minor differences regarding their analysis. Now, we will study the history of these melismas by analyzing the tradition of hymnologia written in the old method. We will see manuscripts from Theophanis Karikis' era, second half of the 16th century, a period during which the foundations of the modern hymnologian tradition were laid, to Peters Vysantios' era, late 18th century.
In order to examine the notational history of the melismas, we have taken into account manuscripts that include hymnologic pieces attributed to Ioasaph the New Kukouzelis, Theophanis Karikis, Panagiotis Chrysafis, Germanos Bishop of New Patras, Balasios the Priest, Petros Peloponnesios, as well as some later exegesis written in the old system. As it is well known, while the new method notation expresses the exact size of the intervals as well as the duration of the notes, the interpretation of the old method is a matter of controversy among scholars who could roughly be divided into two main approaches. On the one hand, we have the stenographic theory. According to it, the interval signs are considered to give merely a melodic skeleton, called metrophonia, accompanied by some subsidiary signs. These notational combinations help the chanter to recall from his memory the appropriate enriched melodies, melos, which were orally transmitted from generation to generation. Since the mid-17th century, Balasios the priest was the protagonist of a practice called exegesis. According to this theory, exegesis was a purely notational process of transcribing in a more analytical way the melodies hidden in the stenographic figures. It seems that this process often happened in a score sporadically. Hence, a notated piece could combine long melodies given stenographically through a group of interval signs accompanied by subsidiary signs with some other long melodies given analytically mainly through interval signs. We could call this kind of notation mixed notation. On the other hand, we have the approach developed by the scholars of the School of Copenhagen, according to which the interval signs are considered to give the very melody of the piece, not its skeleton. Hence, exegesis is considered to be a process of ornamentation and rhythmical elaboration of the old melodies, the results of which were recorded in score whenever it took place.
Stenographic theory seems to be applied in the case of the S3, while its melismas are constantly recorded in the old method through the same interval and almost the same subsidiary signs until Petrus Vyzantios. The metrophonic melody of the interval signs is clearly shorter than the one given by Grigorios Exegesis, a fact that supports the idea that we are dealing with a stenographic figure, the melody of which had never been recorded analytically until the new method period.
Something similar seems to be happening with the two subsets of the S4, since they show stability in their way of being notated in the old method, while their metrophonia is shorter than Grigorios' corresponding melody. What is interesting in this case is that we could observe that the first part of the interpreted melisma is identical to the corresponding metrophonia of the signs, while its last part seems to be stenographically written. One could argue that this is a case of partly analytical and partly stenographic notation that is a mixed notation. The thing is that we deal here with codes written before Balasios, i.e. Ioasaf, Karikis, Chrysafi, Germanos, subsidiary signs of which don't seem to hide any extra melody. Is this a kind of pre-Balasios exegesis, and thus should we move the initial limit of the so-called exegetical period of the notation in the Karikis era? Or are we dealing with a new melody that should be written analytically? And if that is the case, then why not understand phrases that are considered to be interpretations of some hidden melodies as extended versions of the old short melodies which should be written analytically? We temporarily leave these questions to be discussed later.
Things are starting to get interesting when we move on to the S5. Chrysafis and Germanos put a paraκλητική figure, the metrophonia of which gives a short melisma. In a hymnologion of Balasios dated in the mid-17th century, an extended version of the melody is given, which could be a case of exegesis in the sense of transcription. However, another Balasios hymnologion dated in 18th century gives instead of that the old short paraκλητική figure. One could suggest that this is a case of stenography within a mixed notation, but probably not. Manuscript Sinai 1477 is a record in 5-line partes notation of a probably Athonite monk chanting by heart, written between 1750 to 1760. There, we found this melisma clearly recorded in its short version. On the other side, Petros Vyzantios gives an extensive melisma, partially differentiated from Balasios' one, while Grigorios practically records the metrophonia of Vyzantios' record. In sum, we have a melisma that from the mid-17th century until at least the mid-18th century is maintained in the oral tradition in two versions, a short one and an extended one. The later version underwent minor changes until it arrived at Gregorius' ears. The short version was probably abandoned shortly before or during the New Method period. What is important here is that both melodies are found at the same point in different codes of the same hymnologion of Balasios and thus are considered to be versions of the same melisma.
Moving on to the complete version of the S2, things get even more interesting. Manuscripts constantly give the known figure of esotematismos, the interval signs of which indicate a melody much shorter than Gregorius' melisma. The first notational change happened by Petros Peloponnesius, who surprisingly gives in his autograph two versions of this melisma, the second of which is called by himself short. What looks strange there is that the metrophonia of the short melody is longer than the metrophonia of the non-short melody. Vysadios, on the other side, sometimes gives the traditional esotematismos figure and sometimes the non-short version of Peloponnesius. What is more striking is that Gregorios, who interprets Vysadios' scores, gives a melody the beginning of which is similar to the first part of Peloponnesius' non-short version, while its end is similar to Peloponnesius' final part of the short version. The melisma given by the Kotromosian exegetes is almost identical to Gregorios' melody. Sinai 1477 suggests a subversing solution again. We find there the M11, which has a melody identical to Peloponnesius' short version, although this melody is longer than the metrophonia given by the esotematismos figure shown so far in manuscripts. Going back almost 2 centuries, we find in the Hymnologion of Lviv, dated in the late 16th century, a version of M4 notated in Kievan score having a similar long melisma. We also found in hymnologic pieces of the same code long melismas with different melodies at the points where the Old Method manuscripts have esotematismos figure. This leads us to the conclusion that, at least since the late 16th century, esotematismos functioned as a stenographic figure since it was associated with a variety of melodies that were longer than the ones indicated by its interval signs. Maybe this was the only stenographic figure of the notation, since we know that in mid-16th century the Slavs acquired due to Greek influence a sign called theta, which also functioned stenographically for the indication of these long melismas. The M4 of Lviv Hymnologion evolved slightly as it was natural up to Peloponnesius' era. Peloponnesus himself extends or records an extended version of its beginning, probably with the help of Ptolemicon. However, he maintains its already extends ending phrase, which is given stenographically in his non-short version by the exclusive use of interval signs similar to esotematismos metrophonia, omitting the esotematismos subsidiary sign. He follows, in other words, a mixed notation. That is the reason why his short version is metrophonically longer than the non-short one. Based on Sinai 1477, we conclude that the metrophonical ending of the Peloponnesius short version is actually the hidden melody of the stenographical esotematismos figure. Therefore, the non-short version owes its differentiation only the small extension of its beginning part. This justifies Gregorius' choice to use Peloponnesius' short ending in his exegesis. Overall, we have a short and an extended version of this melisma as well, except that the short version has traditionally a longer melody than its metrophonia due to stenography. In the end, an evolved version of Petros' extended melody prevailed. The headless version of the S2 connects us to the S1 melisma, for which we will examine each case separately.
M1 and M2 constitute combinations of double or single antikenoma figures, after to which an ending attached at some point of the notational history of each of them. This ending was either an esotematismos figure, sometimes accompanied by the homonym subsidiary sign, or another melisma. And now the complicated story of the εσωθεματισμός interpretive pluralism begins. Germanos gives for the M2 a sequence of signs, the metrophonia of which is very similar to the melody given by Sinai 1477 for the M11. This melody is identical to the ending of the M1 given by Petros Peloponnesios and Petros Byzantios. It is also identical to the ending of the M2 as well as of another melisma that was not interpreted by Gregorios, given by Koutroumisian exegetes. We thus conclude that Germanos suggests and records analytically his own version of εσωθεματισμός melisma at a particular hymnos. This melody spreads and becomes the melody of the εσωθεματισμός also for other points of occurrence of this stenographic figure. In other words, Germanos actually does a kind of exegesis in the sense of analytical recording of a probably subjective version of a stenographically indicated melisma. This is one version of εσωθεματισμός. Petros Byzantios gives for the M2 another melody, which is a kind of development of the metrophonia of the εσωθεματισμός figure. Gregorios follows his teacher and gives a similar melody for the M2. This is another version of εσωθεματισμός. The M3 is also a very interesting case. At a point where the previous notational tradition of the old hymnologia puts εσωθεματισμός, Ioasaph also gives an εσωθεματισμός figure without its subsidiary sign. This is somehow weird, since Ioasaph acts in a period during which this sign systematically reappears within this notational complex. Charikis, on the other side, puts a sequence of signs, the metrophonia of which is identical to εσωθεματισμός metrophonia. However, he prefers different interval signs. He puts πεταστή instead of the οξία. Chrysafis and Germanos follow this practice, while they also add the subsidiary sign of Theman απλούν. Is that the way Ioasaph and Charikis were trying to indicate a metrophonical interpretation of this traditional figure, which, as we know, had already become stenographic? Was this their way of indicating a kind of shortening of this hidden melisma? Sinai 1477, though written 2 centuries later, has an answer for that, since it gives this melisma with a short melody identical to the metrophonia of the εσωθεματισμός. Thus we probably have a totally short version, or better, a shortened version of the εσωθεματισμός melody. Furthermore, we could not rule out the possibility that this melody was a remnant of an older metrophonical interpretation of this figure. However, Balasios does not follow the practice of his predecessors regarding the M3 ending. Instead, he gives a typical εσωθεματισμός figure. Koutroumisian exegetes gives at this position a melody that, paradoxically, is identical to the εσωθεματισμός melody recorded for the M4 2 centuries ago in the Hymnologion of Lviv. We have, in short, 4 different melodic versions that in one way or another are connected to εσωθεματισμός figure. These melodies seem to have their own life, since they appear sometimes to a particular hymnos and sometimes to another one at different points in quotes written by different scribers. Actually, we see here the imprint of the oral pluralism of the signifieds associated to a single signifier that has a notational stereotypical representation, the traditional figure of εσωθεματισμός on the one hand, and the sound image εσωθεματισμός on the other hand. Regarding now the initial part of the S1 melismas, we observe an interchangeability between double and single antikenoma figures. This notational phenomenon that begins during Charikis period probably represents the existence of both a short and a slightly more developed version of this melody, respectively. Thus, it is a precursor to the prevalence of double versions of melismas in the years of Balasios. The ambiguity of this melisma seems to be maintained in practice from the time of Charikis until before the new method, something that is indicated by manuscript Psachos 132, folio 1 verso.
Conclusions. A lot of interesting elements and few surprises emerged during analyzing the notational history of the large melismatic passages found in Grigorios' exegesis of Petros Peloponnesios Hymnologion. These led us to some general conclusions regarding the interpretations of the old notation as well as the interaction between oral and notational tradition. Firstly, we have to share with you our general way of understanding notations primarily as an imprint of oral practice and secondarily and afterwards as its guide. After all, the pocket size that the Hymnologia constantly had until 18th century excludes their usage in the actual performance. Chanting precedes its notational representation, while the various development of the former differentiate accordingly the way of interpreting the former and consequently the way of its use. In other words, a piece recorded in an earlier era coming into the hands of a later chanter or chant teacher would lead him to understand the corresponding signs according to the current interpretation of this piece. This, filtered by the practiced way of perception, could evolve to a generalization of the way of the interpretation of other notated piece of the same style or mode or the notational system all told. Generalization is, in our opinion, a notion of key importance for describing the dynamic and constantly evolving relationship between notation and orality.
We can comprehensively describe the history of the melody of the large melismas of Hymnologion from the 16th to the 19th century as following. Starting from the Charikis era, second half of the 16th century, we find it more likely that the various melismas were chanted in a way close to the metrophonia of their notational representation. Εσωθεματισμός figure was a confirmed and maybe the only one exception, since we have witness of its stenographic function. The melody hidden behind this figure had various variants, which are witnessed sometimes in one manuscript and sometimes in another. This shows that orality could include various similar melodies under the umbrella of a single name and a common notational representation. These melodies circulated over the centuries, replacing each other in all the places of the pieces where traditionally melisma with this name appeared. And this is a case of generalization. In the mid-17th century, extensions and elaborations of the melodies of the melismas are observed, which however do not replace the previous short melodies. Instead, they coexist until the late 18th century. Hence, a melisma recorded shortly could be sung either in a short or an extended way, and so the notation seemed to be both analytical and mixed at the same time. It is even more striking the fact that, conversely, a melisma, the extended version of which was analytically written, could be sung shortly, depending on the circumstances of the performance. Of course, this seems absolutely natural if we have in mind a model of chanting mainly by heart, especially hymnological pieces.
From the mid-18th century until the predominance of the new method, short versions disappear and are completely replaced by the corresponding extended versions. Thus, the short recordings of the melismas are considered to be totally stenographic, since their representation in practice is now unilateral.
On the other hand, if we assume that Grigorios and Kutlemusian exegetes recorded extended versions that had prevailed in oral tradition for at least a generation before, then each time Petros Vyzantios gives short notational versions of these melismas, his notation could be considered stenographic.
Thank you very much.